that they've got out recently. Before we get into introductions, though, a couple housekeeping items. First of all, I'm wearing one of our swag items, right? Like our Crocs and Socks shirt, so I guess we're featuring that one today. If you want any podcast merch or swag, it is available at merch.absoluteappsec.com. Outside of that, we will be conducting, after our travels to Australia last week and, the fuzzy video that we had for that episode, we will be conducting a virtual practical secure code review with AI course October 2nd and 3rd. It is open to the public. And if you have been looking for an opportunity to strengthen your secure code review skills and want to join us, or have been waiting for an opportunity to grab this is the first really open virtual course that we've done. So go to training.absoluteappsec.com and check us out. So besides that, I did want to give a shout out to our sponsor for this episode, Cloud Security Partners. This episode is sponsored by them. The Cloud Security Partners is your partner in dealing with modern risk. Cloud Security Partners works with customers to ensure that their cloud solutions are architected with security in mind. Talk to them today and mention Absolute AppSec for a complimentary cloud maturity review. While you're at it, check out their podcast, Cocktails in Cloud and Relating to DevSecOps. So they got a couple of those that they run. So check them out. Appreciate their sponsorship and their friendship over the years. We know the guys at Cloud Security Partners. Great team over there. So appreciate them. Cool. Outside of that, Ken, I think you're going to be at Global AppSec San Francisco next week. You got anything going on there that you want to tell people about?
Yeah, Dry Run Security will have a booth, so come check us out. I'll be working that booth for a couple of days alongside Joshua, one of our engineers. It's actually the one who built that LLM testing framework that I mentioned in our most recent blog about how we actually test our LLM to make sure it's not going off the rails when we make changes. So it'll be exciting. If you want to ask us some questions, we'll be there. But yeah, I will also make a note there, Seth, that I'm excited that my travel is winding down. That is my last planned trip. So
whatever. Well, I've got something else to send over to you for 2 weeks out. Don't worry about it.
I'm sure. I'm sure you do. But yeah, also I wanted to mention on the merch front, I made a special request to Seth to get the Logi dark sweater put in completely pink, and that's in the works. So pretty soon I should be rocking a completely pink Logi sweater on this podcast. But in any case, all right. Enough about us. Let's get into Darren's. Oh yeah. Sorry. Actually. Oh, it is there. Okay. All right.
I did it already. Sorry. Like I meant to mention that, right? Like there is an option there. If you don't like that version of pink, or if you'd like to see something else on the merch store, let me know, right? Like we're pretty flexible on adding stuff. And there you will see stuff show up and then disappear. So.
Perfect.
Cool. All right. So let's get into Darren. He's been kind enough to come on and give us his time. So Darren works over at Endor Labs. I know he's one of the authors for the Dependency Management or the Dependency Report for 2024. But Darren, what is your position? What is it that you do over there? And then, we'll dive into more things from there.
Yeah, so I have a really unusual position. I'm a research engineer. So I'm a staff research engineer. So my job is to kind of connect bridges by understanding how people use security products in the world. So it's a little bit DevSecOps, it's a little bit AppSec, it's a little bit software development, and trying to connect all those things, partly to make the product better, but also partly to just sort of educate the market as a whole on like what SCA is, what AppSec is, the different tools and capabilities, and not just security people, but also like the DevOps side of the world as well.
Yeah, that's really intriguing to me, right? Because that's not necessarily a position that we've had called out in that manner. So tell us a little bit how you came to that. Like, what was the background? Like, how did you get into security, and how did you make your way to that? Say it again. Was it chief research?
Yeah, I'm a staff research engineer.
Staff engineer. Okay.
Yeah, and research engineering is a weird thing. Like it's not a very common job role. I made it up a little bit for this role, And it's because I've been in AppSec for 20 years at this point, right? I've been doing this a long time. I started my life as a software developer. I've done my share of racking servers, right? And then like AppSec became a sort of an accident for me. I was always the developer who was like, hey, we should care about this stuff. And my very first AppSec title was at US Bank 20 years ago. And they didn't even call it AppSec at that time, right? They had to coin that word a few years later. And then it just sort of went from there. It turns out that I was better at that than the software development end of it. I really like the kind of socio-technical systems aspects of it. And it just has continued to go on. And I've done a stint as a researcher. I was a security researcher at Veracode for about 8.5 years. I ran the AppSec team at CrowdStrike for about 1.5 years. And then kind of enticed me over with the Star Wars theme, because I'm a huge Star Wars nerd. You got to give them credit for that one. And then, just this idea of, taking something that people see as kind of a checkbox of just doing software composition, right? Tell me what my dependencies are, enumerate my vulnerabilities, and actually doing a good job of it, and getting on top of that whole, like, hey, there's too many alerts, right? And prioritization is stupid hard. And good ideas about how to do two things I'm passionate about together, which is vuln management and program analysis. And I was like, oh, that's a perfect fit for me. So that's kind of how I ended up working within Endor Labs.
Awesome. Well, what are some common misconceptions around SCA that you find yourself trying to sort of manage with folks? I'm sure there's plenty.
A lot of it is people treat it as a compliance checkbox, right? Like, they'll have FedRAMP or something, and they'll be like, all I got to do with SCA is give it a manifest file, and it'll tell me what my dependencies are and what the vulnerabilities are, and I can go fix them, or I can use CVSS or whatever to prioritize them. And it's pernicious because, like, that's not actually a terrible place to start. It's just, it very quickly gets out of hand for people, right? You get 1,000 applications or 1,500 applications, and now you have 30,000 alerts, and you're sending a report to developers, and they do this. They look at it and they go, trash can, right? And then nothing gets fixed, and then everybody's angry, and then you're not meeting your compliance objectives. You're also not meeting cost objectives, because you're trying to either fix the world or fix nothing, or you fix all the criticals, but half of them are too hard to fix, or whatever the case may be. So what a good SCA does is really help you make good decisions about managing vulnerabilities based on what your organization's risk tolerance is. And you can't do that without understanding the application. And that's what a lot of, like, the first entrants to the market, they were just like, let's get data in front of people. And then they all kind of, we benefited by the fact that everybody else kind of hit a wall and went, hey, we don't know how to prioritize this stuff. So we got to learn from our predecessors pretty deeply and go, hey, good setup work. Now let's take it to the next gen and go, let's make this about managing and fixing risk, rather than just being, tell me everything is wrong in my environment. That doesn't help anybody.
Yeah, raw data versus contextualized data that is risk centric or risk focused. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Cool.
Sorry.
Oh no, I mean, I was just going to dive in on that a little bit. I know we're going to get to the report here in a little bit, but you're talking about contextual analysis. You're talking about understanding the application and how those third-party dependencies are used. Like, what are the triggers? What is it that you're keying off of? Talk a little bit about that, because I know most people in the market, right? Like, they think about it and they think about, like you're saying, the early entries, right? Your sneak, your dependency check, right? Like running NPM audit or whatever it is in order to get that list of out-of-date vulnerability or out-of-date packages. So where is it that Endor Labs is taking that?
Yeah, so there's two levels. There's kind of like see more and then focus on less, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And it kind of solves these two problems. If you get something very simple like Dependabot, for example, Dependabot's an outstanding product. You click it, turn it on, you get all kinds of data. But it's also a very limited product, because if for most languages, it's only looking at direct dependencies. So stuff your developers have picked. They're getting better at that, right? They've started to kind of realize that, hey, that's not going to cut mustard forever. But so the first thing we do is we look at the entire environment and we look at what actually gets resolved by the dependency managers. We're not guessing at it based on a manifest file. So if somebody has like a private Artifactory or something like that, where they might be resolving to a different thing than the public Maven, for example, Like we're going to actually see that difference, and that limits like false positives, false negatives, because we're going to look at what's actually going to ship to production rather than what could theoretically possibly go, right?
Yeah.
So that's the first thing, is kind of get that breadth and have really good vulnerability data. We have a big research team that goes through and corrects all of the affected versions, right? Because you get research teams, their security researchers are fun people, right? Because they're busy, they want to do a lot of stuff, and they want to do stuff that's splashy.
Yes.
And so they'll test, hey, I found this problem in version 2.4 of something. I'm going to test 2.1, 2.2, 2.6. Okay, it seems to be fixed in 2.6. We're good. And they didn't bother going and regression testing the whole thing, because who has time? And the answer is we have time. We go do that work, right?
Okay.
We kind of correct the affected versions data. We identify where the vulnerability is. So we look at each thing and say, like, hey, there's just one or two functions typically that are actually vulnerable across this huge library.
Yeah.
And then once we have that identified and all that data corrected, we can do program analysis. So we do static analysis, very similar to how advanced SaaS tools work. Where we're not just looking at source code, we're looking at source code and built code and library objects and things like that. And we're building a call graph and an analysis tree. And so we're looking at how does your first party code actually use the code in those third party components. And that lets us give a very important answer, which is, does this vulnerability actually affect you?
Yeah.
Because, and we're honest about it. We'll do a yes, no, or maybe, right? And I think that's one of the big differentiators that people kind of don't see until you explain the power of it, is that we can search exhaustively and say, well, we couldn't tell if this is reachable, which happens a lot, right? Like it's maybe 5% of the time. You just can't tell unless you run the application. And even then you can't tell sometimes. And we'll just tell you, look, we couldn't tell here. And a lot of our competitors, if they're trying to do reachability at all, they'll say everything's unreachable unless we can prove otherwise. And that doesn't help anybody, right? And if you don't know why, you can't do it. So we basically are breaking this stuff down into going like, hey, on average, only 10% of the vulnerabilities that are going to be identified actually have reachable code. There's a lot of variance there, but that's the average. It's 9.5%, I think it is. And why would you spend time working on stuff that we can prove there's no path to, right?
Yeah.
You can't exploit it. Why am I wasting my time?
Yeah. I mean, and that's like, I love that we're finally getting to this stage, because this has been, I mean, like me as a third party helping clients develop their AppSec program, as this has been always the sticking point with SCA, right? Has been, okay, like you're saying, like there's this full list. What do I actually need to go work on? And they usually don't want to pay consultant rates to go in and figure that out, which I totally get, right? Like, they don't want anybody, it becomes cost prohibitive. That's all I'm saying. So seeing tools come out that actually do effective reachability analysis is just like, it does feel like the next progression. It feels like where we should be going. And I dig that you've got a team that is on top of that. It's interesting that you're saying about 5%. You can't actually tell. My other question, outside of, okay, the maybes that are there without running the application, is the CVEs, the vulnerabilities that are put out that for these dependencies that don't actually have any detail on where the function is. Like, you see these all the time. They're like, oh, there was XSS here, right? Is your research team digging into those to figure out what those functions are, or how do you actually handle it?
Absolutely, yeah. So everything that's in our database, which we go back to 2018 for CVEs, a little further in a couple cases, but generally speaking, for any language we support, and we support 9 languages now, we go back that entire CVE history and we look at every single individual. It's actually OSV, so it's a little bit bigger than just the NVD. That's kind of our controlling database. And we identify every single place and we say, let's figure out what function was changed. Where's the commit that fixed it? Of what was changed in that commit, which were relevant to the vulnerability, right? What was the fix really? And we actually use it for 2 things. We use it for, one, this kind of reachability analysis, right? To tell you, are you calling that thing? But we're also using it for our upgrades and remediation capabilities. So we're going to tell you how difficult it is to upgrade, and what your risk is. Because I don't know if you guys have written a lot of software in your life, but like upgraded dependency sucks. It really, really does. It breaks a lot of the time. We actually, one of the things in the research report is we found that like 95% of upgrades recommended by security tools have at least a chance of having breaking changes in them. Right.
Yep.
And maybe you get bit, maybe you don't, but like that's high probability. So we're actually doing backporting patches as well. So if you need to go from like, an old version of Jackson Databind to 3 versions up to fix the security vulnerability, that's never going to happen. You're going to end up accepting that risk. So we're actually using that same research to identify and backport the actual like minimum viable patch to all the older versions that you can then pull out of our database and do like just a security update to whatever version you're using.
Nice. I mean, that's super effective, right? Like from a developer perspective. I mean, like, yeah, Ken and I, like, we've been involved in the development process. You say this, and I'm thinking about recently, like a React app that we were dealing with and got built on some framework or some theme, whatever it was, right? That was, that happened to use a dependency that was a beta dependency of like, and the amount of effort that it took to go from that to a supported version, right, of that specific library was non-trivial. I mean, we're talking, tens, if not hundreds of hours to actually get that all up to date, which is like, you think about it and it's ridiculous, but it's also, yeah, that is exactly the problem that we run into, right?
So, yeah, sometimes you gotta, right? But imagine being asked to do that to close a medium severity vulnerability. Right?
Yeah, exactly. Where you're just like, no, never mind. Like, we're just going to accept that risk and move on. Well, okay. So that brings us to the dependency report, right? And I think here, I'll grab the link here. We'll drop it in and then we can start taking a look at it. So it looks like this is the 2024. Is this the first dependency management report you guys have released, or have you done it in the past?
No. So we did state of dependency management last year. We were very young as a company. We've only been around for 3 years. We've only been kind of publicly known for a little under 2 years at this point. So we did one last year. And when I say we, it was my colleague, Henrik Plate. He helped with this as well. He was my co-author here. I actually, more accurately, be the other way around. I was the co-author. And so it was him and some helpers from a contracting firm. And it was very much focusing on the open source because we didn't really have customer data yet to dig into and find out about real world apps. So this is the first time we've been able to actually analyze customer data in depth and provide some insights into, how does the theoretical things about how open source works, how do they actually meet the road when customers are adopting these things in real products? Okay,
cool. So, was that the main driver behind releasing this, or like, do you want to talk about, where that actually started?
Yeah, so there's a couple things we talked about. Should we do this again? Was it valuable? And early in the discussion, we figured out that it was pretty valuable just for us internally to do the work, right? To figure out what was going on in the open source world. Are our assumptions about what we're doing correct? And so we kind of decided to kick down, like, do we publish this or not decision later and just do the research for our own uses, right? To kind of validate our assumptions about, are we building something that's useful, right? And then, like, as we did the data analysis, we found like there's actually quite a bit of knowledge here that people might find interesting that's not vendor specific, right? So we wanted to give back a little bit, and a good chunk of our company is embedded in open source. Like, we love open source as a community. And so we want to give back a little bit to the industry and help people adopt it and kind of know what they're taking on.
Okay. Well, good. Ken, I've been talking a lot. Yeah.
No, because I did actually want to dig into since you mentioned the open source bit there, I did want to dig in because I thought it was interesting. I guess a couple points. One, that you guys make a statement that NVD data is not enough, essentially. So if you go to page 12 there, Seth, and scroll down, you can see the ecosystem coverage of CVs. So I'm obviously summarizing a more elegantly put statement here, but it's basically that's what it comes down to, is NVD potentially not being enough in terms of a source of CVEs for vulnerability managers. So yeah, that's the first part I wanted to dig into and hear more about. I think a lesser component to that too was talking about, sorry, let me scroll down to the interesting thing here. Sorry, there's a lot to read here.
Yeah.
Well, let's start there, and I'll get back to the second statement, which I thought was super interesting here in a second. So
Yeah. So I mean, I don't want to have anyone come with the idea that we're like casting dispersions on, NVD or OSV or any of these. They're all super valuable. We consume them, we use them. What we do isn't possible without them. The thing is, you can't really build a vulnerability management program around them on its own. The data is too inconsistent. These things are very difficult to scale. As we saw kind of earlier this year with NVD being way behind for a little while as they were trying to make the world better. Right, they had to take a big productivity hit because it's hard to keep up on this. They have to keep up on every vulnerability in every product for every purpose ever reported. And with security research booming, and with like AI and people doing AI reports that are of dubious quality, right? It's this huge workload now for NVD, for OSV, for any of these public database maintainers. And what we realized is, from an application vulnerability standpoint, doing what we're doing for open source packages, that's a much smaller subset. So one of the things that we can bring to that is we can bring our research and work on the subset of stuff that matters to an AppSec program without necessarily trying to cover the world like NVD has to, because there's just not enough data, right? There's NVD and other databases like it. They most of the time don't have data about like what the affected function is, for example, right? So we have to do our own research to do that. They rely on the reporting researchers in most cases to figure out affected versions. That's always going to be a little off because, like, I've been a security researcher. I know I wasn't super thorough about testing all of the versions it could possibly be and finding out exactly when it was introduced. I don't have time for that, right? I'm trying to collect my bug bounty. So, like, the reality is, like, they're a really, really valuable public resource, but they're not really sufficient to do a vol management program around because there's not nearly enough data for you to go after, what is the problem really? Is this something that affects me? How high a priority is it really? I mean, CVSS base score is pretty much all you've got in most cases. And thank goodness for EPSS because it's making that better. And base score, like, it has some problems. It doesn't talk about your environment. There's a little bit of bias that creeps into it. And it's nobody's fault. It's just how it is. The vendors are going to tend to downplay the CVSS a little bit, and researchers are going to tend to overstate it just a little bit. And it's just human nature, right? So, like, it's not enough data to really make effective decisions is what it comes down to.
Yeah, and I mean, so and on top of that, so actually, I'm going back to that, what you said. We actually had Kyle Kelly from SemGrep say the same thing, where it was NVD lacked sort of the details that they needed, so they actually have researchers that have to go, if it's on GitHub or if it's on a public repo, they can go and kind of do some research and figure out, like, what is the actual vulnerability here, how's it affected, and what, like, to your point, like, what functions actually matter, or what classes or however it's instantiated and used that's vulnerable. So that was one thing. But I think also, the report brings up on that page 12, a couple other interesting things where people are putting in, whether it's a GitHub advisory or it's something related to NPM, or it's these different sources that don't necessarily even have a CVE, right, through NVD. Yeah. And that I thought was, it should be obvious, but I think, or to me, it should be obvious, but I don't think it was. So that I did feel like that was an interesting data point. I don't know if you want to expand on any of that, or if it's just.
Yeah, it's a lot of disjoint data, right? So, like, we use OSV as kind of our primary, but we actually consume 5 different public databases. OSV seems to be the most complete generally for the things that we care about. And honestly, it speaks really highly to the work of, like, the NVD and the people who participate in it, that this number is as small as it is. But if you're trying to run a vol management program, like, if you're FedRAMP, you only care about the NVD because that's all that FedRAMP cares about. But if you're trying to just work on a risk-based program, if you're trying to actually boil down risk, like, this is going to concern you. It's a minority, but it's a big enough minority that you go, well, crap, I have to figure out a way to consume this. And the reality is, like, if you're not, buying a vendor that does some of this work for you, and a lot of us do, it's not just us, then you're stuck trying to figure out how to aggregate these sources together. And Like they disagree about a quarter of the time. And there's gaps on either side, right? There's stuff in the NVD that's not in OSV and vice versa, right? There's, do we put things in here that are contested or not? Like there's all kinds of human decision making that goes into building these databases. And so you can't just grab one and go good enough, right? Those days are over, I think.
Yeah. Also, to your point about aggregating data, I mean, I can remember every job I've ever worked as a practitioner trying to protect a company. I had to subscribe to, whatever their tech stack was. I needed to subscribe to the mailing lists and newsletters to get any updates about things. And that was, and yeah, go into whatever newsletters, Slack channels, whatever, or Campfire back then, whatever it might be, to get that information. There was not always a centralized place that I could rely on 100% of the time.
Yeah. And I bet you spent a lot of time trying to normalize data so that you could ask meaningful questions of it too, right? Because heaven forbid we all have a common format.
Yeah. And actually, also on that note too, there would be, especially I remember this with like Ruby on Rails advisories, having to actually download the patch and do a little bit of, okay, what's actually vulnerable here, and figure that out, like, to understand what the real issue is. Because I do believe there had been at least one instance in which we did resolve, but that wasn't the true fix and it wasn't the true issue. But I'd be going back in my memory banks, meaning they were wrong when they released the advisory. So looking through those patches became even more vital. I did want to ask Seth, can you go down to page 21 as well in the document?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Just because I thought this was the second piece that I thought was really interesting. So you all did your research, and I'll just read the TLDR there. Across 4 ecosystems, Endor Labs and OSV only agree in 72% of cases on the affected packages. In 12% of the cases, they mark an intersecting set of components as affected. And in 10% of the cases, Endor Labs marks one additional package. So if I was to try and understand that, I think what you're saying is that sometimes there are components listed as vulnerable that are maybe it's a duplicate. Is what it sounds like. That's what that sounds like to me. I could be wrong. And the second one would be
it's duplication, but it's also just like, where do I report the vulnerability, right? If there's a vulnerability in one of Jackson Databind's dependencies, do I report it as affecting Jackson Databind or just as the dependency that the vulnerability is actually in? And there's not a standard answer for that, right? Like we have our own opinion, obviously, but like the other opinions on it are perfectly valid. You can make an argument in any direction. And so what we're looking at is as we compare, and like the OSV data was the easiest comparison for us, but we did kind of a lightweight analysis of others. Numbers are very similar. And it's not necessarily that OSV is wrong and we're right even. It's just that there's so many human decision makers involved that where we've done very careful research, we find that our research just disagrees with whoever did the data entry for OSV, and who knows how carefully they checked, right? They might be just importing something from NVD. Who knows, right? And that's kind of the nut of this whole thing is the whole vulnerability reporting thing as a public database is messed up, right? There's not commonality. There's 9 or 10 different databases you got to track. OSV is, I think, probably the best aggregated single source for like dependency related vulnerabilities that we've found. They're doing great work, but even there, like we disagree on, what versions are impacted, or we disagree on, hey, you say it impacts these 3 components, but like we looked into it and we actually think there's a 4th, right? Which is very common. So it's just like, what do you share? What do you reveal? How do you express the truth of what a vulnerability is and what it affects? And like, there is no standard answer. There's no like, they're factually incorrect. It's just, they think about it differently than we do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I can see that from a security research perspective because everybody, I mean, like we've done this from just like basic threat models in the past and what people assume to be risk for an application. Even among AppSec practitioners, everyone has a different answer, right? Mm-hmm. Like somebody's really concerned about authentication or whatever package, somebody else is concerned about another one and that business data flow or what have you. And so that difference doesn't necessarily surprise me. We did have a comment from Juan in Slack saying that, basically this is just never going to be sustainable, right? Like, how do we make this a sustainable process? I mean, it feels like that's what you're trying to do, at least within the realm of the customers and apps and the packages that you are looking at. But I mean, this goes back to that XKCD, right? Like, okay, we have 10 providers of vulnerability data. Do we add an 11th, right? Like, does that really help? And then how do we consolidate that, or where do you see the way forward there?
Yeah, I mean, in the immediate term, the unfortunate answer is you kind of have to rely on your vendors to do this work for you. And when you're picking AppSec platform vendors, you should really be asking, how they're addressing this, because there are people in the marketplace that will just grab public data and do nothing with it, and like do better, right? The good vendors, I'm going to try to avoid naming names, but like the good vendors out there are doing this work and trying to aggregate and be a source of it. And the cost of doing that is so high that it's only tenable right now to do it for like the slice that a vendor cares about. Longer term, I think we need to see, some of the larger industry vendors, people who aren't necessarily security vendors, the Microsofts of the world, right, the Googles of the world, doing this and kind of gifting it to the open source community because they have the resources to do it. I'd like to see NVD be better funded, but that's a complicated thing, right? Because that gets politics involved. But that's what we need. Is we need the kind of the big players to commit to saying we're not just going to take the narrow slice that we care about. We're going to try to do a good job on everything, which is what GitHub and Microsoft have tried to do with OSV, right? That's kind of the first stab at doing this, but it needs just way, way more investment in order to get this level of quality across everything that they track. Like we can't do it across everything they track. We do it across the stuff we support, right? Because it's so onerous.
Yeah, I mean, and like, Ken, the same question would go to you. I mean, I know you were more involved on the NPM side, but and I just don't understand how we make that sustainable or where that actually starts, right? Like, without some sort of government regulation, it's which I shy away from as well, right? Like, industry is usually a better solution, but at some point somebody's got to say this is the way it needs to move, right?
Yeah. So what you're saying is you believe in S-bombs. That's what you're saying, Seth. That's what I'm hearing anyways.
That is
actually,
the one true way.
It's funny. I actually didn't see S-bombs mentioned in the report. I was looking for it too. I kind of assumed that would come up. I don't know why I assumed that would come up, honestly.
We honestly haven't seen that much adoption across the industry. Like there's the executive orders and things have required that people be able to produce them. And that was one of the very early features that we had because we, like a lot of people, thought it was going to be a bigger deal. But like the big barrier to true adoption of using S-bombs to trade things around is going to be that kind of clearinghouse type model of I have the S-bomb, where do I put it that people can consume it? There's privacy considerations, there's intellectual property considerations. So the market as a whole is just sort of figuring out, like, we know we need the ability to produce them. And if we're heavily regulated, we know we need a library of them, that we can grab and find for versions. But we don't really know what to do with them other than show them to an auditor and have them, check a box and go, yep, it's there. The development of Vex is improving that, and that's going to get baked into CycloneDX soon, I hope. I know the working group is working on it, because that vulnerability annotation of being able to say we're not fixing this and this is why will be very valuable. But there just needs to be some kind of critical uptake where you get security platform tools being effective at consuming them. We've had a few of our customers use our S-bomb hub to consume things from other people. And their biggest problem is they can get people to generate the S-bombs, but you can lie, right? So how do you validate an S-bomb? It's just a claim in XML or JSON, right?
Also, like the S-bomb could change pretty frequently, right? I mean, it's good. It depends on the development shop and their velocity, but that could potentially change a lot in a week or a day or whatever. I mean,
and people who have to generate them for compliance or because they've got a big, there's a few big players out there who are like, we need an S-bomb for everything we buy. And like, so, customers of ours that have that kind of use case, like they end up just auto-generating an S-bomb as part of their build, right? And they've got it linked to every single version. And anytime someone says, I need an S-bomb for your app, you go, great, what version? Let me pull it from our library. But that's the thing, is like, it doesn't do you much if you're just going to take that and compare it against the NVD for the reasons we've been talking about, right?
Right.
Like, it doesn't tell you whether it affects you or not. It doesn't tell you what the real risk in situ is. It just tells you, you have this component, that component bad. And that's just not, that's not as helpful as everyone expected it to be, right?
I think the only real value it provides at that point is in the case of, a log4j or something like that. You can go potentially back and look at the suppliers. If you want to go that far, you can look at which of your suppliers are impacted. But beyond that, it's like,
yeah, and that's exactly why
kind
the
of hard.
ingestion thing was for that kind of incident response thing of, if you get SBOMs from all your vendors and ingesting them into a database like that, then when you say, oh, hey, there's log4j happens, right? And where am I impacted? Where do I have that version? Not only in my software, but in my third-party software, so I know how big of a deal this is and where, and I can start making resource planning decisions rapidly, right? And also where not to go look, right? Oh, we're safe over here. That has a lot of value, and I think people are starting to see that that's what SBOMs can do, but the tooling and the standards and the sort of standard operating procedures just aren't there yet. I'm hoping that's going to change, because I think they're a really powerful tool, but it's you're dragging the industry kicking and screaming, right?
Yeah. Well, that's been my thing, is adoption's been more of, sorry, Seth, but I'll just finish this thought, which was, whenever I've spoken with folks about how they're using SBOMs, it's like, well, we're like forced to, from a regulatory standpoint, generate them. So that's what we do. And I'm like, okay, so like, what else? And they're like, so we generate them from a regulatory requirement. Like, okay, all right, I see where this is going. So it doesn't feel like it's making not moving the needle a ton in a lot of orgs. But Seth, sorry, what were you gonna say?
No, like my thought there from I go to what Darren called out earlier, which is what is the validation there, right? Like for SBOMs in particular, right? Yeah, you generate them, but a running application, I mean, it's the same problems we're having with reachability, right? Like, hey, it almost feels like we're having to generate those based on an abstract syntax tree or something else when you dynamically run an application to really truly tell you what those packages are that are being used and being dependent on. Because I mean, we've all done this, right? Like, we've all loaded packages via npm or whatever else that we don't end up using further on down the cycle, or we're not cleaning it up, right? Like, it's very much a maturity thing on what those SBOMs look like and whether or not those packages are actually used. And so, like, what is the true risk that's associated with them is based wholly on what is running in the application, not necessarily what we've put into that XML file that we've released to the public, right? So I just struggle there, and maybe that's why the pickup hasn't been that great from a tooling perspective, because it doesn't change what we're doing from a security perspective and a risk perspective, whether or not the SBOM exists, because we've already kind of worked our way around that. I mean, Darren, you guys have over there, if you're already doing reachability analysis, SBOM doesn't necessarily give you that much more, does it?
It really gives you stuff for third party, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's where its utility is. Like, I'm not going to use and consume an SBOM for my own stuff internally unless I'm a huge org and I have like cross business unit politics I have to navigate, right? Where my AppSec team can't scan your app, right?
Yeah.
That's about the only time you'd use them internally. Otherwise, you're going to use them as part of like your third party risk program, right?
Mm-hmm.
You get your vendors to give you SBOMs so that you get that kind of incident response visibility into, like, tell me what you're using. I can then come back to you and say, hey, what are you doing about these vulnerabilities that you have? Are you aware of them? What's your management strategy? Right? It gives you a kind of common basis. We all agree this is the fact. But again, there's that thing of somebody can lie, or they can give you the wrong SBOM, or you mentioned unused stuff. Like, I have not yet seen a customer onboard to our platform where we haven't found at least a handful of dependencies that just nobody's using anymore. And they're still in the manifest. And like, they're still going to be in the SBOM because they have to be, but get them out, right? Get rid of them.
Yeah. Import statements that aren't used, right? Like that. Yeah.
And you can't do it without like understanding the application. Like the old days of SCA, just looking at a file, I think those are done, right? You have to know context or you can't, it's not useful anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Well,
I speak with a lot of customers or potential customers due to obviously my role. And yeah, I'd say that's kind of what I keep hearing over and over again. It's not from one specific dependency management vulnerability tool. It's from all the players we've had around for a while, where they're just creating essentially noise and stuff that just doesn't get resolved and just gets shoved to the side over and over and over again, to the point where it's like, then what are we doing here? And it's that old school style of just raw data without contextualizing it and surfacing real risk that seems to be biting people. I also wanted to, by the way, point out one thing in this report that I really am happy that you all highlighted. It's sprinkled throughout the report. I mean, the last mention of it is kind of a TLDR on page 41, where you're talking about AI projects posing unique challenges. It's funny you say that, because as somebody who works so heavily in the Gen AI world right now in the ecosystem, it's probably the thing that scares me the most in terms of like dependency issues. And I mean, we've talked about on this podcast, like Hugging Face, for instance, having keys exposed in 700 models could have been uploaded with malicious or overwritten with malicious models. So that's keys exposed on GitHub of developers that own those models. There have been obviously libraries included that were malicious. Regarding libraries that you use to work with LLMs. For me, I look at the breakneck speed of the competing abstraction level libraries for doing interactions with vector DBs or with LLMs, or just in general the ecosystem bits that you use around LLMs. And that's concerning, because you have pull requests and changes coming in from all over the world at too quickly of a speed to be really well vetted. And I see them using AI systems to review those, to interact with the authors that are committing things and answer their questions. And all of that leads to, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I look at all of this and I see the perfect storm of putting the same sort of, or having the same sort of vulnerabilities and attacks and supply chain issues in AI related tool sets as I do everywhere else, but it seems like they're not as mature in that regard. So I was happy to see, and this is a lot of my words, I don't want to put words on your report. I'm just saying that, I'm happy to see that you all called that out, and I'd be curious, if you would provide a little bit more color on sort of your thoughts there.
Yeah, there's really three things, right? There's the fast-moving target that you talked about, where because a lot of these open source projects are so fast-moving with such a large number of contributors, the discipline that you would normally expect from a more mature project just isn't there. And it can't be there, right? Because it slows things down too much. And it's so competitive right now. Nobody has time to go slow. And it means that things like, there are vulnerabilities, people will report them on a mailing list and they never make it, into any kind of OSV or NBD or any of those things, right? Nobody takes the time to do a formal report. People are generating a lot of code with AI, and like that's going to have more things because, many eyeballs make bugs shallow, zero eyeballs make them deep, right? So it's cultural changes in that way. There's also the issue of kind of like how these things are used and packaged, because the traditional software development thing of like all of my dependencies go into a manifest file, and then when I build, they all get packaged. That's not how AI people work, because they're like, I don't know which version of TensorFlow you want, right? Because it's going to depend on all kinds of other things that I as developer aren't necessarily going to control. So here, go ahead and pip install TensorFlow of whatever version you want. Well, how on earth does my SCA tool know that that's even there if it's not in the manifest? Right? That's a problem we call phantom dependencies. We built a whole capability around trying to get out in front of that. And the last thing is models as dependencies, right? When people are building AI stuff, where we think of the model as kind of like, oh, it's just data. And security, we generally don't worry too much about data quality of a data dependency. That's a QA problem, not a security problem. As long as it's encoded properly, we're good, right? But LLMs changed that conversation, because those models and similar large generative models like that, they work differently. They're going to affect the operation of my application. It is one giant command injection when you really think about it, right? When you're seeding any kind of output control to an LLM. So you need to have the same kind of dependency management discipline around LLM models as you do around the software dependency parts. And the industry as a whole has been really reluctant to address that problem, right? We've kind of been kicking the can down the road. I don't think that's sustainable. I think we have to address it.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of research come at this, or in terms of LLMs and things like prompt injection and the other, gosh, what's the weird term I can never remember, Seth, for
Hallucinations?
no, no. I'll think of it. There's another attack technique too that's newer. But in any case, yeah, it's so we see a lot of offensive research in that regard. And we do see, so like AWS Bedrock has like guardrails to help with some level of prompt injection. And there have been some techniques described on how to put a layered approach in. Also, there's was it Gand? They had the Gandalf challenge. What vendor was that for prompt injection? Seth.
Oh, yeah,
Lectera, yeah.
Lectera, yeah,
Lectera.
yep.
Yeah, but on the whole, most of it's around offensive research, which obviously comes before the defense gets. But yeah, I'd say yeah, it's when someone asks me a question, they're like, how do you see LLMs? Do you see them as an API? And I'm like, yeah, to me, they're kind of just an API, and then obviously there's more to that in terms of how how they operate. But to most products, they're kind of just an API, and how you secure your interactions with it is a bit different in this one case. It's ultimately, I guess, it's the same underlying problem of all injection, right? Confusion between what was intended and what was not. But it is, I think you're right. It's a bit unique. And then the LLMs themselves, the models themselves, to your point, yeah, they can be vulnerable themselves. They can be a problem themselves. So they are a weird dependency that's not a dependency, but I don't know how to say it any other way.
It's strange.
Yeah.
Like you said, it's like an API, but it's also non-deterministic. So like
True.
all of the ways we're used to securing this stuff are based on like, I picked a thing, I know what it is, I know how it behaves, and maybe I missed something, but that's a me problem, not a computers are non-deterministic problem. And this is like playing D&D with a computer, man. You never know what it's going to roll.
Oh man, hey, you know what? And on that note, not to plug this too hard, but I did create an article around testing because of, actually I say it in this article. The only reason I'm posting this article is I talk through like testing, how we actually have to test our LLM. But basically what I say in there is these things misbehave quite a bit. Yeah, they don't repeat themselves. They're not designed to. They don't behave in a deterministic way out of the box. And their underlying core features to never really act, never really behave deterministically, like you said. So yeah, I highly agree with all of that. They more than I've spent a long time with these. Well, a long time, relatively to when they've been out. And yeah, I can concur. It can be frustrating in any case. But yeah, just happy that you all kind of called this all out.
Along those lines, then, yeah, from your perspective, Darren, like AIs so LLMs as dependencies, is that an area that Endor Labs is then pushing to actually look and see how that can be validated, I guess, or at least like vulnerabilities called out there? I'm wondering like what's going on, what the future kind of holds for you guys in that space.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is it's moving so fast, no one really knows for sure.
Yeah, we don't know.
Definitely a thing that we're investing in, right? We're looking at, how do you get visibility? How do you identify the things that you care about? Because it's not just going to be security risk; it's also going to be intellectual property risks and all these other things that are not really unique to LLMs, but work weird, because of the nature of a model. So we are looking at how do we identify those things? How do we get provenance for those things? How do we validate that, the model that you tested against is the one you're shipping to production? Those kinds of problems. It's an area of investment for us. I would expect that you would start to see us talking about features like that in the not too distant future.
Okay, cool. Well, good. Now, like I do want to be cognizant of your time, Darren. So we've got 5 to 10 minutes left before we kind of wrap things up for today. I wanted to give you an opportunity to like highlight the what you found interesting during the creation of this report, right? Like, what was it that has kind of like piqued your interest when you talk about all of these different dependency challenges?
Yeah, I think the thing that jumped out about me was like, I've always known that dependency upgrades are not the easiest thing in the world because I come from that software background, but the degree to which that is true was surprising to me. Right. So Henry did a bunch of analysis on security updates across multiple ecosystems and looked through them and said, hey, let's look for breaking changes or potentially breaking changes. And, was there a function removed? Did a function signature change? Those kinds of things that could potentially make you not be able to upgrade by just upgrading, updating POM XML or whatever. Right. And I expected it to be, half the time it would break. And it was like 95% of the time. Right. And even in patch versions, right? Like 75% of the vulnerabilities out there, you can update to by just going up one patch level. You don't have to even do a minor version upgrade, which if you're following Semver should mean no breaking changes, right? But much of the time, 75% of the time, there was still at least a potential breaking change in there. That was part of the fix upgrade, right? And it's like, nobody's really following Semver. They might be trying, but like, it's not a thing you can really enforce rigorously very easily. So like you're kind of playing dice every time that you do a dependency upgrade that, am I going to get bit by this potentially breaking change? Is it going to break my code? And to me, it really highlights like that's an AppSec capability that we're going to need as an industry. And we've kind of started building one ourselves. We call it upgrades and remediation, boring name. But like it's to kind of identify like, what is the risk of upgrade before I ask developers to do it? Because how many times as AppSec practitioners have you had developers come back to you and say, I can't fix this. It'll take me a month because it'll break everything. Wouldn't that be nice as a practitioner to know upfront that that's true about your application and not just like developer fear? Not that it's not justified fear, mind you, but like it'd be nice to have a shared set of facts. And it's another thing that you can use program analysis for, right? You can like, what am I using? Am I using a thing that changed signature? Am I using a thing that disappeared, right? That's going to break my code. And you can get, it's hard to say absolutely yes or no, but you can get kind of a risk assessment of how risky is it to perform this upgrade. And it shifts that maturity model of AppSec from just risk of vulnerability to what's risk to my business as a whole. Because fixing vulnerability has risk too, right?
Yeah. Well, and that was what I wanted to highlight out of what you just said, because this is the common complaint from business and from the development, the engineering orgs, is that security comes in and basically drops a huge task bomb on them when they're like, hey, you got to go update all these dependencies, and doesn't realize that they just push back the development schedule by 6 months just by giving them a list of dependencies that need to be updated. And so what does the business do? I think this kind of brings it around full circle to what we talked about. Most of the developers will take that and be like, accepted risk, and then just drop it on the side because they've got 15 features from customers that have to go out the door next month. That's not making those changes. Yes, it reduces security risk, or it could, right? Based on, what we've talked about, but it could reduce security risk, but it doesn't actually affect money for the business or money for the organization. And I mean, honestly, that's where, as a business person, that's where I'm going to turn to. What is it that brings me money, right? Like, yes, you can go fix these dependencies, but unless one of their customers is asking for that sort of upgrade and analysis, I'm going to leave it, and it's going to go on the backlog, and it's going to get worse over time.
And from a developer's point of view, it's theoretical, right? Like I'm
Yeah.
telling you
Yep.
something might go wrong. Meanwhile, I've got a backload of stuff that's actually going wrong that I can prove.
Mhm.
What am I going to prioritize?
Yeah. Yep. That's it. Yeah. That's a difficult problem. I mean, 75% though, man. I guess like I was more with you. I was thinking like a quarter to half the time it would be a breaking change, right? Like from a gut perspective. But I guess I'm not overly surprised having done upgrades in the past. And I'm sure, Ken, you've run into this too, especially in the AI space if you're pulling those libraries in.
Oh my God.
Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
I won't mention the one that I don't want to put them down, but man, yeah, there's one that makes breaking changes in minor versions literally all the time. So yeah, experience that.
Yeah,
Quite a bit.
Kubernetes is notorious. Like TensorFlow did it for a bit. Jackson data bind is always a mess, right? It's so complex.
Yep.
Like there's definitely things where it's more of a problem. And the pernicious thing is it doesn't bite you every time, right? Like there could be a breaking change and luckily you don't use that part. Right. And so when it does bite you, like every time you feel like you're rolling a saving throw, right? Every single time you go, because it could be easy or it could be a week's worth of work or a month's worth of work to try to figure out.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Hey,
I think
Ruby
we've
was
all done
ahead of
like
the curve here.
yes.
They've
We've all
been
done
introducing
get
breaking
rebase.
changes and exactly the libraries been way before everybody else. So yeah.
Yeah.
Anyways.
Well, great. All right. So yeah, we've been talking for about an hour. Again, I want to be cognizant of Darren's time. Thank you so much for coming on. Darren, is there anything else you want to highlight before we wrap things up today?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've covered the report pretty well. I just want to encourage people. Like one of the things that I get to do as a researcher is I get to talk to a lot of people who are adopting tools, not just ours, but across the AppSec platform space. And like so many times, we're under such constrained budgets. We're under such constrained time. Nobody has enough people. Nobody has enough time. And I think people kind of lose sight a little bit of what the goal of AppSec is because we're so focused on the immediate thing right in front of our nose, right? And that kind of shifting toward we're trying to protect the organization, right? And we're trying to do it with not enough money and not enough people. So it's very, very important just as a practice to kind of shift toward focusing on what's important. The idea that we can fix all the app risk or even most of the app risk in our organizations, it's never going to happen, right? We actually started a whole community on this concept called Lean AppSec, where we have practitioners come and talk to people about like what it's like to be successful with almost no resources. And it's extremely well received because people understand like they're trying to fix everything all the time, and you can't. You have to figure out how to work with your business, work with your developers. It's a team sport, right? You got to figure out what's important to the business and get those things going. And it is about what tools you buy, but it's also about like the relationships that you build and like it's the people stupid, right? Like it's the security champions programs, it's the business, it's the understanding what people care about to really get stuff done. Because if you're not fixing this stuff, what's the point of any of it, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Man, like you just dropped Lean AppSec on me, man. Like I'm like, oh crap! I just pulled that up, and I'm like, dang it, we could have spent the hour talking about that in and of itself. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, and maybe we'll have to do a follow up episode. So,
Yeah, no kidding.
Anyway, right? Like, yeah.
Can I say a couple things here real quick? One, thank you for not making me put in my details to download the report. That's awesome. That's fantastic.
Yes.
And the second is a question. Are you going to be at AppSec SF next week? Or
Me personally, no. I'm actually going to a number of things on the East Coast shortly thereafter, but we will have an Endor Labs presence there. There will be a number of very, very nerdy engineering-oriented people who are going as well. So there'll probably be a lightsaber somewhere. We like to do that.
I see one in your background.
Awesome.
There's actually, we're doing a series of events for AppSec practitioners only, where we're gonna like very little light on the sales pitch because who likes to go get sold to, where we're gonna have people actually learn lightsaber combat from a qualified stage combat instructor.
Ooh.
We're doing one in
Awesome.
New York in a couple of weeks here, and we're gonna try to do it in more cities if we can. So I've been busy with helping get all that off the ground.
Nice. That's
Sweet.
actually really cool.
Yeah. Well, we'll watch. Like, so if people want to interact with you, like, what's the best way to, to start that conversation?
I'm gonna sound old. Honestly, the best way is probably LinkedIn. But I am on infosec.exchange, which is a Mastodon instance. So those two places are probably the best. That's where I hang out the most.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, we will push people that direction. But otherwise, Darren, great conversation, super interesting report. Happy to have you. And thank you so much for your time. We'll have to do a follow-up at some point, talk more lean AppSec and maybe even more dependency management stuff, but really
Absolutely.
appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Ken, anything else before we close things out?
Thanks for the report. Thanks for your time. And thanks to the listeners.
Yep. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We'll see y'all online.